an original.
From Story Studio Network.
Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
Let's get ready to rumble!
It's showtime.
Indeed it is. Here we go. It is Friday, March the 29th, if you're counting along at home. Welcome in, Dave Trafford here. It's On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. We often have a Good Friday, but this is the Good Friday, so welcome in. It's good of you to join us. Keith Leslie here and John Wright, per usual. We missed last week for a variety of things, but we're back in the saddle, and good to be here. And, we spent a lot of time in the last episode talking about the carbon tax and the merits of that argument, and it seems that John had only caught fire in the last 10 days. Again, more of the premiers lining up against Trudeau taking them on, the Conservatives in Ottawa calling the scientists and the economists here so-called experts around it. So I wondered, at what point does this become a dead horse for all concerned? It's easy to say, the federal Conservatives or the Conservatives at Queen's Park have caught the attention of the general public talking about affordability and attaching the carbon tax to it. To me, it becomes where we've shifted into a stage where the rhetoric is more effective and more powerful than the actual effect of the tax itself in terms of what people are feeling.
Well, I wonder what it's going to be like after next Monday or Tuesday, because it'll already be, applied. It was interesting listening to Pierre Poilievre come out from his meeting with the Manitoba Premier yesterday afternoon, to which they were, the reporters were kind of hoping or thinking that he would be a little more tuned into the discussion at the table with the Premier rather than his rhetoric, and they were absolutely wrong. I mean, he walked out of there and gave, in French and in English, about a 4-minute each stream of axe the tax, spike the hike, and just on and on and on and on and on about it. So clearly, when you talk, as we said last week, when you talk about a 23% increase or whatever 20-odd% it's going to be, it's on the tax as opposed to the whole thing. But they've blown it up and making hay out of it as the official opposition would. But you kind of wonder what it will be like in the week after it's in. It's not going to go away. The government's not going to repeal it, although we'll see what comes up in the budget on the 16th. I think to tie that to what we've seen in Ontario, it just struck me when I was looking at the budget and everything else, is the measure of error on all of the calculations for any provincial government in a budget is very, very slim. I mean, if you have a GDP which is, a small amount off, then it makes all of your projections off. If you have an interest rate increase or a cut that is not coming, all of your projections are off. And as a result of the carbon tax or any other thing that slows the economy down even a little bit, it means that deficit that you've projected is probably going to be much bigger. So, I know we're going to focus on the budget today, and which is kind of a blur after a while, right? Like it's just one big number and a whole bunch of other moving parts. But it just brought home the fact that, yes, the rhetoric, and it's been brilliant by the Conservatives to target Mr. Trudeau and go after him, and he's now changed tack. He's moving in a different direction, which is more urban, more female, back to kind of, everything from renters' rights to daycare. Just the enormity of the challenge in a post-COVID world where there's all kinds of competing interests for money, that a carbon tax or whatever, it just shaves a small amount off of the rifling where you're going to take your shot, and you could be so far off at the other end a year to two down the road. I think that's what I got out of both of those things this week. Mm-hmm. It's an incredible thing where you're talking about, as I said, a tax on the tax, which is not that much when you really do the calculations. But even 3 cents at the pump is going to have an impact on people's decisions on what they do with their money, and that's going to have a big impact on provincial budgets.
Well, Keith, the Tories at Queen's Park were all slapping themselves on the back about cutting the gas tax here in Ontario. The day after, I went down the street to gas up, and gas was up 4 cents. So, I mean, how do I know? All of this
You're not going to notice
that's attached to it. I mean, there's no way to actually see that effect.
It at least gives Ford extending that gas tax cut again to the end of this year. I think it's 5.7 cents a liter. Yeah. It at least gives him the right to criticize. Here, we've at least made something a little more affordable. Although, as you rightly point out, the fluctuations in gas prices day to day could be more than 5.7 cents, or certainly in a week. So I don't think most people will actually notice that, but it does give Ford some ground to stand on. Unlike all the Conservatives' position on this axe the tax, what's your alternative? And to Doug Ford specifically, Ontario would not be facing the carbon tax had you not cancelled the cap-and-trade system that the Liberals brought in. That exempted Ontario from the federal carbon tax. So you canceled that, which was put on the polluters, and they could buy and trade these carbon credits. Didn't affect at the retail level whatsoever, as far as we could see. It didn't get much of a chance to really get going. But you canceled that. That's why we're subject to the federal carbon tax. And, of course, again, the other part of the Conservatives' argument, they're offering no alternative, and they're completely ignoring the rebates that the economists keep pointing out are benefiting. Basically 80% of Canadians are better off, a little bit more ahead financially with the rebates than, and paying the carbon tax than they would be without. I think for an awful lot of Canadians, it's still the whole carbon tax idea is virtual signaling. It's not really going to make a difference to the overall global fight to climate change. That's a different argument. On this particular one, this axe the tax, what's your alternative? And they simply do not have one. And as I say, it's Doug Ford's fault that Ontarians are subject to the carbon tax.
Well, I had to laugh. Scott Moe had talked about, we've looked at it in Saskatchewan, and we're going to, see what we can do about it. Well, what's our alternative? And I think on Axe he had posted, his office posted, well, we've looked at alternatives, but we found that they're too expensive. And Andrew Coyne says, that's the fucking point.
That's the argument.
That's the whole idea.
Argument.
So, the idea that somehow we shouldn't be putting a price on carbon is really at the heart of this conversation.
Yes.
And to your point, how do we use that to mitigate climate change and so on? It's a single tune, though, John, and that's the problem with this particular subject, because the whole idea of saving the planet, or saving us from the planet, because she's going to kill us before we kill her, the idea that there's only one way to do this, and that is either you pay your carbon tax, and you, by the way, you don't have any choice in terms of how you heat your house, pretty much. It's either electric or you're putting gas in there. We're not looking at alternatives to that even. But if you're going to heat your house, chances are, we're all going to we have to pay that carbon tax. It's not like you have a choice one way or the other. So there's only it's a one-trick pony. There are no alternatives even to the carbon tax in terms of how are we going to deal with emissions. And to me, the federal Liberals, maybe even the Conservatives in Ontario and across the country, provincially, are missing an opportunity to say, yes, we care about the planet, we care about the environment, we care about the air our kids are breathing. Here's how we're going to make sure that emissions are lowered, and here's why it makes sense for you to do this. And that's in the form of all kinds of new infrastructure, whatever it might be. But to get down this rabbit hole does two things. It gets us way down a path where all we're talking about is something that means nothing to anybody except the rhetoric that you point out, and we're not really dealing with the issue that is threatening the climate.
No, and it's in the same way that the carbon tax is now the focus of a political opposition. It reminds me again of the GST when Mulroney was there, because it's basically axe the tax all over again. And in retrospect, it may be that it remains in some way, shape, or form because there are very few other ways to offset it. Look, I look at public opinion on this stuff, which is, you have on one hand, you have a very deeply concerned public about climate change and about its effects. And even on drinkable water. I mean, you've got 70-odd% of the people in this country who believe that, we produce 20% of the world's fresh water, and that we're going to have real problems in having equitable access to fresh water and climate change, like even the very basics and the cost and everything that goes with that. You look at that, and now you have the opposition parties, which have rightly so cottoned on to a very, very specific message. And Trudeau happens to have an adversary who is an expert in the clip. Like, he just over and over and over, everything in this country is Trudeau's fault. Everything. It's just hyphenated, right? Like, every traffic accident is because of Trudeau. And so it's come at a time when you do need to have the alternatives, where you do need to have that sitting around the table with the premiers and everybody else to come to some conclusions because of the effect, whether it's going to be increased forest fires this summer, or it's going to be the sap that can't run in the trees because the season is so short. All that whole array of stuff. And what we're left to do is to argue about one form of how to deal with this, as opposed to a collective way about dealing with it overall. So rather than going at it head on head, what you have now is the Trudeau government, of course, heading down in a different direction, and that is we're going to get right down into the weeds of protecting of affordability and for certain groups, and we're going to get right into that area. So it's kind of abandoning that whole argument. Mm-hmm. I come back to the beginning of what I said, and that is that all of these things tie into a budget which is a reflection of the agenda of the day, of the demands on the system, and you are running out of money. You are running out of, when I look at a deficit as big as it is, and I think people are always shocked when they hear what the size of the provincial spending is. It's $214 billion.
And that's on top of a budget the last time around that was the biggest spending budget in Ontario's history.
Yeah, and we're back to the deficits of Kathleen Wynne, and it's kind of like you feel that there's a horse that's run away and you can't get control of it. Like, where do you go with this? So I understand on the one hand that we've got priorities within the priorities. I mean, who doesn't want high-speed internet? Like, who doesn't want a whole bunch of other infrastructure pieces done? Who doesn't want more houses built? But it has to fit within an envelope that also looks at the bigger existential things that we're trying to deal with. And I don't know where you get the money to deal with this stuff unless you are, in fact, using taxation models to try and remedy it. I just don't know. So it's an interesting time when we have governments across the country who are going to face the effects of all of this stuff this summer, and over the next year or so in a more pronounced way, dealing with the environment, and at the same time are arguing over how to implement some kind of measure that mitigates that, and it's just not coming together.
Well, just on the budget then, Keith, and because I think that's obviously sort of at the heart of a lot of what we're talking about this week. I get that we're talking about affordability. I understand why we're talking about affordability. And I understand, this whole focus on the deficit. But you will know better than anybody, having covered the number of budgets at Queen's Park. For the most part, the budget in and of itself is, a media play. It's a media snapshot because it's meaningless until at the end of the year we actually look at the balance sheet and figure out what was spent and what wasn't spent and where the surpluses really are. So, I don't know that we worry as much about the deficit as we should, or we worry more than we should, one way or the other. That has never really settled well with me. But clearly, maybe more so than we've ever seen, this seems to be a budget that was driven by a political agenda with a view to an election cycle in the next 18 months.
Absolutely.
Right?
I mean, first of all, to John's point, who doesn't want 4 more police helicopters? I mean, who doesn't want everything in the budget? Like, their spending priorities were certainly questionable, but their spending is the issue. The progressive conservatives are spending, and have been since they were elected in 2018, like drunken liberals. There was $50 billion increase in revenue during that time. They spent every penny of that and added $100 billion to the province's debt. $100 billion in 5 years. These are not fiscal conservatives by any stretch of the imagination. As you say, they've set out their priorities. They've, $190 billion, I think it is now, for their highways and transit and housing and all the big infrastructure projects that they've got going. But the fact is, to your point about not knowing until the end of the year, last year they predicted that I think the deficit for this year was going to be $1.5 billion. Then last month they predicted it was going to be $5 billion. And then it comes in at 3, but next year's is going to be 10. What the hell? Now, it turns out $6 billion of that is from their wage freeze legislation and the compensation that they've now had to pay out to all the public sector workers who had their wages frozen for 3 years. That was entirely predictable, but at least they did have some reserves set aside. We said, why do they have $5 billion in reserves? Now we know why. So they at least, but the financial accountability officer says that figure from $6 billion for those wage settlements is going to double to like nearly $13 billion. So the deficits, they just don't seem to care. They're big spenders. And they're all about their legacy projects, and will they, the highways, the transit projects, and we still hear the same from Doug Ford. And yet, even on this, it wasn't in the budget specifically, but people were looking for this government, and he shot it down to say, as part of his housing strategy, that they would allow the fourplexes province-wide. And he just shut it down. No one wants four-story. Well, we all know a fourplex does not have to be a four-story building. It's just ludicrous for them to have such strong housing goals and, offering municipalities extra money to meet these housing goals. You have to make a pledge to build municipally with the province and all this. It's just they seem to have lost their way completely on the housing file. And the budget itself, I mean, there was nothing new there. The budget did show they're not meeting their housing targets. They're going to have to go quite a long ways to get up to their 1.5 million homes by, is it 2032, 2030, whatever it is. They're way off on their housing targets. So this budget, it offered very little help for the municipalities who are dealing with the homeless and drug addiction crisis, on their streets. There was just very little there that was new, that was helping people. The affordability stuff was all previously announced. The auto insurance stuff is virtually a joke. It looks like it was written by the auto insurance companies themselves. If you take less coverage, hopefully for us, we'll let you reduce your premiums ever so much. Well, last time they tried that, the premiums actually went up. And the Liberals rightly referred to this because it was Kathleen Wynne who first promised in 2015 at the NDP's pressing to lower insurance rates. Wynne called it then, and the Liberals repeated it this week. That's a stretch goal.
Stretch goal, yeah.
And that's exactly what that is. So no, she's not going to. But here's the Tories coming right back in with the same stuff.
But here's my problem with that, and as shiny and as fancy as that sounds, and as attractive as that sounds, I've got options that you can opt in, you can opt out. Well, that nonsense. What's not included ever in that equation is that when you take a lower rate on your insurance, it means less coverage. In the end, it means you end up in hospital, or you end up somehow, people are going to end up paying that difference one way or the other.
What they lower is your catastrophic coverage. It's not the little stuff they lower. It's not your collision. No, it's the catastrophic coverage. Think about that when you're saving yourself $50 or $100.
Yeah. Yeah,
it's scary stuff, and it always has been.
And it never comes out in the wash when we start to explain that stuff. But as we talk about this, John, and I realize it's great fodder for the gallery at Queen's Park, and there are important issues that are brought up in a budget. But increasingly, I look at these. It doesn't matter where they happen, whether it's at Queen's Park, federally, across the country. Increasingly, I look at them as becoming more and more meaningless. Because there's nothing in there that actually says, because we put $213 or $214 billion on the table, it doesn't mean it gets spent. It doesn't mean it's going to the right place. It doesn't mean it's going where the wheel is squeaky. To me, it becomes, again, just this pattern of rhetoric that we end up including in the daily briefs so that we can point to that when we're running for re-election.
Yeah, I don't know what else to add to that. I mean, we're long in the tooth enough on this broadcast to remember that when a budget was coming out and a finance minister accidentally showed something on the corner of his desk that had a number on it, people would howl for a resignation from cabinet. Now it's like any speech that you're told to give the parameters. Basically say, tell them what you're going to tell them what you told them, and sit down. I mean, it's all there. And in fact, what we see now, of course, Justin Trudeau over the last few days is rolling out the budget. Like, there it is. It's right in there. So it comes down to then down to two things. One is what message do you want driven out of that, because it's an artifact of politics. And so there's that. And then the second thing is budgets tend to define the character and the nature of the government that's running it. And with this particular government at Queen's Park, I'm not sure what that is. Like, I don't like, it's not. Go ahead, Keith.
This is a bit inside baseball. The story came out this week, but it plays exactly to what Dave said about where the budget and when it's presented. The government this week, it was announced, or FOI documents proved, I think Canadian Press got them, that this government has spent $300,000 to create a new communication center in the basement of the legislature, specifically so, and they started with this budget, they would not have to use the media studio. In the media studio, reporters get to ask endless questions. There's no one question, one follow-up. We can ask, and they come from all sides of the room, and it's a bit of a free-for-all, but it works, and it works very well. And on occasion, when it's a big, like if the Premier's having news in the media studio, the press gallery president would actually anchor it and pick who's asking questions. And so it wouldn't be like a total free-for-all, but the media studio would not be limited to, which you are in this new communication center, $300,000, one question, one follow-up. They did this on Budget Day this week. And not only did they do that, they did not offer live streams. Normally we have embargoed live streams to watch the finance minister, Mr. Bethlen Falvey, then the opposition leaders come in, and it's all embargoed until the minister speaks at 4 o'clock. But these news conferences start around 1:30, 2 o'clock. No live stream, anybody off-site. You had to go in this crowded little room in the basement, which, I mean, it's relatively small. It's just ludicrous. And then part of it was because, of course, there's a lot of construction at Queen's Park. The normal lock-up room where they lock up 3,000 or 4,000 journalists is not available. So they put them, to lock them in this basement room, specifically not to allow live streaming and not to allow more than one question. It's all, back to your point, it's all about the messaging. Budget Day is all about just our message. We're going to get it out. And they actually took steps with this by spending $300,000 in the studio to limit the opposition's ability to get their message out. Because if reporters, certainly off-site reporters, couldn't talk to them till after 4 o'clock, they're filing, they're running. Your opposition is just lost at that point in the day. So this is all about government messaging and taking some nasty steps, it seems. There's literally no reason for them to have created this communication center other than to limit media access and media questions.
So if the message around this was supposed to be about affordability, to me we're looking at the wrong end of the telescope here. Because when you begin to look at what, Ontario is doing in terms of business, manufacturing, productivity should be at the top of the list, shouldn't it? I mean, doesn't that solve a number of the problems that you talked about, John? If we need more money, the best way to do that is to have a productive economy. And the numbers right now show that we do not have the productive economy we had 10 years ago, period. I mean, across the country we don't. And we're certainly suffering here, relatively speaking, in Ontario. What was it? Was it, Keith, they were comparing Ontario to Alabama? I mean, in terms of, that's the kind of strength we have here in Ontario.
That's what the bank's economists are pushing, right? That we're just, our productivity is so low, and that's the way out of a slowed down economic growth, 0.3% going up to 2% next year. The only way to do this is, as they say, productivity. And Ontario's productivity is at record low levels for the last, this century.
I don't know how to answer that. I mean, I found it rich that the deputy bank, Bank of Canada, the deputy for the Bank of Canada is out talking about the lack of productivity and innovation when, in fact, the amount of interest rate that they've poured on the economy, in fact, have slowed all kinds of stuff down. Like, I understand that even they have decided they're going to have their own communications piece. They've decided to open up after they have the statements on what the interest rate's going to be. We now get questions on that. We can see them fanning out as deputies to different parts of the country and having speeches at the Empire Club and the Canadian Club and a whole bunch of other places and kind of wading into lanes which it's kind of like, shut the F up. I mean, honest to God. I mean, stick to your lane, and the lane is right now that you're trying to bring down inflation by hiking the interest rates as big as they are. Well, the number one thing that's driving interest rates in this country is interest rates. I mean, you can look at all of that sort of stuff. So, of course, it's going to have an impact on productivity. But my point in this is you can measure it, but people don't understand what it takes to do it. So tell me how the government is supposed to provide an environment to increase productivity. Now, I'm sure we could have an economist on here and a bunch of others who would be able to say, this is what they have to do. They have to cut this. They have to cut that. Well, what does that mean? Like, are they going to provide more incentives for corporations and others to do the things that are going to increase productivity? Does it mean that our workforce needs to be upskilled for a whole bunch of things? Because we just finished talking about a deficit and the size of the budget and everything else that the government is doing, and it's got to come from somewhere. So I don't, when I find that when I've done a lot of research in my time on public opinion, and what I find is that people talk about innovation as if it's some magic wand that you wave, when in fact innovation is a very kind of iterative process. It's not something which you kind of go and do and it suddenly produces. Or the productivity of the workforce. Coming out of COVID, we've certainly got a bit of a change the last time I checked in terms of how people are working and where they are. So I find it, I don't know, I'm interested in, if anybody wants to chime in, but I find it a bit of a shiny object. That kind of gets us off the discussion, because the question is, what do you do about it? Everybody complains about it. And then it's kind of like, well, the business community say, well, we need red tape cut. We need taxes cut. We need more corporate innovation for this, this, and this. Where does it leave you? Exactly where you started from. So I don't know what the answer is. I understand what you're saying. But, what you'll then get are governments who say, yeah, but we're also the fastest growing, second fastest growing under the OECD in terms of our output for GDP over the next, 2 years. So this becomes nothing but a debate about figures. And so I don't want to sound completely ignorant on the leveraging of all of this. But from a public opinion point of view, I don't know how you affect that kind of change without having governments spend money or reduce the corporate taxes or other things in order to make that work. I don't know how you do it.
But they're spending money. They're spending records amounts of money, and we are still not addressing the question of productivity. Not even in the messaging. We're talking about affordability as opposed to productivity. And to me, that's, making life more affordable is just as vague as it is making, having a more productive economy, based on what, the frame that you put around it, John. I mean, I get it. But if we're spending records amount of money already, where is productivity in that priority list, Keith?
Well, I assume it's coming from the massive investments into these EV battery manufacturing companies and the other auto sector that we're really, billions of dollars is being put out here by the promise to create or to put Ontario into the EV economy. And hopefully they're boasting now that they're getting ahead of China. I mean, if that's true, that will absolutely boost our productivity level. And as we know, auto sector jobs have a lot of spin-off effect. I think it's 7 jobs to 1 is the usual ratio they talk about. So they've made some serious investments here. Will they pay off, or will EVs turn out to be, I don't want to say a fad, but something that just doesn't catch on to the degree that the governments are counting on it to catch on? Are these investments the right ones? But that's where they put their money. So at least I think there's clearly some ideas there. They're also putting a lot of money into skilled trades development, training workers up. So I think they're putting money in the right places. But are the companies investing, or are they just doing share buybacks and just coasting along without reinvesting in the economy? I think a lot of it is the corporations themselves. And, of course, we've got almost oligarchies here. We've got some very large corporations that don't have to invest if they don't want to. They squeeze as much profit out of every possible way they can, and that's what we're seeing.
Yeah, I had to laugh. I saw a quote, something to the effect that when conservatives overspend or spend record numbers, it's called investment. When the Liberals or the NDP spend it, it's called, socialism and crazy over the top waste of money, right?
Yeah, but the other side of the coin is we've also got a provincial government, which I can't argue about it. You're either going to pay the price at the municipality and your taxes and everything else for the stuff, or they're going to upload it and take it away. I mean, they've taken large swaths of highways that the city of Toronto was responsible for, and huge amounts of money they were spending on. They've taken that away. They've just done it in Ottawa, where they've uploaded that. They've uploaded a whole series of other things that would have. I mean, it's a transfer of debt.
Right.
Yeah. Like you call it infrastructure, but it's a transfer of debt from one municipality to the provincial government. And as a result of that, you are increasing your liabilities from doing that. The question is whether or not the municipalities themselves now are out of debt or whether they just keep spending themselves into more to fill up the difference. So there's a whole fiscal issue here in terms of how we're reckoning the post-pandemic world and how we're reordering it on one thing. And again, it was watching the demographic announcements which were made yesterday that we're now as a country at 41 million people. But for all of the increase that we had in population over the last year, something like 2.4% of it was new people. I mean, it was babies born. New people, sorry. It was babies
well, they are.
born.
They're brand new.
I mean, it's a very small percentage now of babies that are being born versus those who are coming into this country to try and, look after the rest of us through their tax revenues. But what I'm saying is that we're now having to look after huge amounts of influx of immigrants to shelter them and to give all kinds of things for their sustenance in this country. And it's got to come from somewhere. It comes from the municipalities and again the provincial governments. And again, we're uploading all of this stuff, but it's not filling in the holes in the bottom. It's just continually going.
Well, even they put $1.8 billion more in the budget this week for municipalities for housing infrastructure.
Yes.
Well, that doesn't make up yet for the lost development
Not at
fees.
all.
It's still not even half.
Close. Yeah.
So you can't keep putting all this stuff, as you say, the province is uploading somebody, but that's putting it on property taxes. That's essentially all that municipalities have is property taxes. You can't keep going this way. It's just too much for people to handle. And property tax actually like 10%, 15%, they get knocked back. But that's what there's, this is what people are facing. And it's because of the different levels of government, as you say, they're moving debt around. They're just shifting it from one level to another. And there's the single taxpayer that's out there. I don't know how we get around this, but what you're going to see now is there's 443 other municipalities that, unlike Toronto and Ottawa, didn't get their special deal. Ottawa got over $500 million in addition to a highway being uploaded. So you've got a whole bunch of other municipalities, and we talked about they're dealing with homelessness and drug addiction and newcomers and so many other issues, social issues that property taxes were never designed to pay. So we need more provincial and federal help on these fronts.
Before we go, a couple weeks ago, we spent the entire episode talking about Brian Mulroney the day after his passing. And over the past weekend, it was a rather vivid affair, his funeral. And I thought it was, some of the conversation that went on was, extraordinary. And it's interesting to see how history has treated Brian Mulroney. In the interim, note the passing of Roy McMurtry, the former Attorney General here in Ontario and the Chief Justice of the High Court. And my father-in-law worked for Roy McMurtry, and he also worked for Bill Davis in the day. And eventually my father-in-law, Mike Fitzpatrick, was appointed to the bench, and at a time when McMurtry was the Chief Justice. So they were rather close through their careers. And when McMurtry retired from the bench, I had the opportunity to sit down with him in his office at Osgoode Hall. And I listened back to that interview this week, and even today, he talks about a lot of the things that are on the agenda, including, some of the major decisions that came out of that court, including same-sex marriage. That includes just how we select our judges. And so he was reflecting on, his time on the bench and the state of the judiciary.
But I think the people of Ontario and indeed of Canada are very well served by the judges who have been selected. I mean, there's the odd one that turns into a bit of a disappointment, but when you look at the overall average, I think
you don't want to name names or
it's
anything,
extremely good. No, I don't.
And at the end of it all, I pondered, John, he ran for the leadership of the Conservatives at one point. And you think about that. So whether or not he would have been, that kind of leader politically, he could have gone on and continued there or, made a dent as the Chief Justice here in Ontario. There's a bit of legacy there that I think a lot of people kind of don't really fully appreciate in terms of what McMurtry did.
Yeah, what I was at the funeral at St. James the other day, and it was absolutely packed. I mean, it's been a week of almost one state funeral and one that was almost one. And it was interesting to see even Mr. Kretschmer there because of his involvement with Mr. McMurtry going back to the kitchen cabinet for the Constitution, things like that. Look, these, again, having watched both of the funerals, you do get the sense that there was an era within which Canadians and these premiers walked in the land of the giants. I mean, I was a parliamentary intern at Queen's Park when Roy McMurtry was there, so that's 1980, 81, and then I went off and I worked with Norman Atkins and Hugh Segal for 6.5 years, and it was by no mistake. The only story I tell in this is I came out of the office, I can see in my mind's eye, coming out of the office and turning around to head towards the reception area, and at the end of the hallway was where Norman Atkins' office was. Hughie's office was behind me. And standing in the door was Ian McKinnon from Decima Research, Alan Gregg's sidekick. And there was Brian Armstrong, who was also a notable organizer for the Tories and involved in the Energy Board. He was a great lawyer. And Norman beckoned me over, and I came over as a loyal young employee, and he looked at me and he said, "You're on the McMurtry team." I said, "I'm sorry?" And he said, "Yeah, you're on the McMurtry team, and we're going to do it, and I want you to be in charge of policy." I'm sorry? So my job from November through Christmas and into the beginning of January was to write the policies, the policy book for Roy McMurtry's campaign, and people can't see this, but I am now holding it up. There it is. Gathered from the garage. And at that stage, Ian McKinnon and I wrote the whole damn thing, basically in the span of about a month. And you look back on it, and his fingerprints are all over this, and it's much dealing with the stuff that we're dealing with today in a very pragmatic way. It's a word that you don't hear much about nowadays. And so there was, I just recall the loyalty that was on that campaign. There were 300 delegates that came to that convention. They all knew that Roy was going to lose on the first ballot. There was the Grossman, Timbrell, Miller slate, that went to the end and Frank Miller won. But there were 293 of them that didn't vote on the successive ballots. They all had their jackets and they sat there and didn't move anywhere. He moved on the floor, but his delegates did not. And I just would say that from a political point of view, he was not the most. He was not the best politician in the sense that while he was working the file, he was always Attorney General. He wasn't going around the province like Larry Grossman was, as the head of tourism, and then the treasurer, going to every nook and cranny of the province, handing out money or handing out free tickets or things like that to people, or meeting at Kiwanis clubs. Roy McMurtry was the Attorney General, and he continued that through his entire career. The landmark decisions that he made in his later days were a direct reflection of what he dealt with during the time he was at Queen's Park. I mean, we think of the bathhouse raids, and then we think of the same-sex marriage decision later on. We think of Susan Nellis and some of the decisions he made later on in terms of the transparency of the court process and the judiciary. He was a one-note, pragmatic, incredibly thoughtful and intelligent man who brought in a lot of people who stayed very loyal to him, but in terms of political ambition, didn't go further than basically his own front door. It was really an amazing time to be part of that and to watch it, and to even hold up, as I said, the policy book today in my hands, McMurtry, Policies and Priorities, which if you read today would have the list of all of those things that we have here. Like I can turn to the pages on the elderly and look at, we need to visit them more in their homes and they need to age in place, all that stuff. And it just reminds you that the same issues that were talked about back then are the same issues we're dealing with today, some 40-odd years later. But
he was heavily involved in the Second Chance Scholarship as well. All of those sorts of things that we still see kind of bubble to the surface. But it's interesting to see how He was, I guess, the high commissioner in Britain at one point, Keith, and then came back. He was did some law, and then ends up being appointed to the courts. And I asked him specifically, is there room for electing judges? And very quickly he said no.
Yeah.
Right. But he was also, Keith, the guy who oversaw the Truscott reference, right?
I was there for that. I was in there for that.
And cameras in that courtroom that time, right?
The cameras were in, and I had this new thing in my hand called a BlackBerry.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm trying to keep it out of sight of the three judges at the top of the room, including Mr. McMurtry, while I'm typing. And they're using these putrefaction, in other words, that the autocorrect is trying to, oh my God, it was a nightmare. But that decision alone, that Stephen Truscott thing, my dad, when I was a teenager, when I was like 13, he said, you need to read this book, the Stephen Truscott story. And then when I was there in that room, it just was a real full circle for me. But on Mr. McMurtry himself, I was a young reporter in 1984 when I got to Queen's Park, and he was clearly Bill Davis's wingman, his number two. And from what I heard, he'd been that way since they played football together in university. That he was just, and he was always, as John said, the Attorney General. He wasn't looking to be anything else because he had the number two spot. He was the guy. And he was very thoughtful. He would scrum with reporters after question period. And I remember on one occasion we used to try and catch them on the way into cabinet meetings. And he happened to be the first one to show up one day. And we're sitting around, we're peppering him with questions. And he's taking them, but he had enough. And someone said something he didn't like. Well, that's enough of that. And he turned around, and of course the door was locked. We've always seen those ones. And he was,
right.
And he's such a big guy.
Oh, yeah.
And he was just such a presence. And he just turned around, oh, damn. And he was very good about it. But I had this interesting connection. It was a bizarre thing. I've had the same massage therapist for over 20 years. She's really good. Woman from Colombia. Came here as she was about 20 years old. Well, one of her other clients was Roy McMurtry. And he would pepper her with questions of the day. She said, she would ask me, okay, what's this mean? What's Doug Ford doing? What's Rob Ford? Because he would be peppering her and have all these opinions. Now, she would never tell me what he said. But she said, he's always asking me these things. And so can you tell me some things I need to know? Because he would engage with anyone. He really did. He felt it was important to get her opinions on stuff. And he would ask her about leadership candidates and taxes. And it was just fascinating for her. But it told me something of the kind of man he was, that he was engaging and just taking opinions from wherever he could get them. And that never left him. This is after his time as Attorney General and High Commissioner and all these other things and Chief Justice. This is when, later in life, and he's still she said, oh, he's engaged. He's always engaged. And that was just really something to hear, because he clearly was engaged at the time. And as I say, as a young reporter, I found him quite intimidating. He was such a big presence and very thoughtful. But at least he did say, when that locked door thing, which has happened to so many of them, he at least showed the smile and had a sense of humor.
Few people will know, those who are close to him will know that he was a painter. He in his spare time, and that's what he did to kind of distract himself. And we have 3 of his small paintings at our cottage that was given to my father-in-law as a gift. And when I talked to him upon his retirement from the court, I asked him if he was going to do more painting. But what will he do once he sort of steps away from the bench?
I often mention that my wife has, from time to time, reminds me that our wedding vows did not include lunch. So
find your own pal. Yeah.
So I expect to find some work to do, and maybe associated with a law firm.
Yeah, I mean, the whole idea that, sure, if you're going to retire, you're not going to hang around the house. You better get out there and find something to do. So I was lucky enough, smart enough, accident or design, I still have that interview. It runs about 32 minutes with Roy McMurtry, and it will run this week on Now and Next. So if you get a chance, and we talk about a lot of the stuff that we've touched on, and just his general idea of where the politics plays, where the courts play, what our impressions of both are, and what the intersection of our understanding of all of that is. And the Truscott thing is an important one, not only because of the decision, but because, Keith, he viewed it as an opportunity for the general public to see how the courts worked. Doesn't like the idea of having it in the lower courts where, particularly in a criminal trial where, it would have a different effect. But to be able to see it play out and in front of people. So if you get a chance, I'd encourage you. You can check out Now and Next wherever you listen to your podcast. In fact, right where you're listening to this one. That'll do it for us. Keith Leslie, John Wright, I'm Dave Trafford. This is On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast for Story Studio Network.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.